Your little signs are an eyesore, Sergeant. They violate Section 7, Paragraph B of the covenants regarding unapproved landscape ornamentation, and I'm telling you right now, they're coming down. The voice was a grating symphony of entitlement in cheap perfume, a sound that could curdle milk from 50 paces. I turned from where I was checking the tension on a new strand of barbed wire and saw her, Karen Miller, the self-appointed queen of the Northwood Estates Homeowners Association, standing there in all her glory. She was a woman built like a filing cabinet, stuffed with decades of complaints, clad in a pastel pink tracksuit that strained at the seams, her face a mask of smug certainty. In her pudgy, ring-laden hand, she held one of my freshly posted "No Hunting" signs, ripped clean off the oak tree I'd affixed it to. Her golf cart, the official chariot of her petty tyranny, was parked haphazardly on the edge of my property, its tires crushing the wildflowers I deliberately left for the bees. Another 3 of my signs were already tossed in the back. Lying there like casualties of a suburban war, I didn't even know I was fighting. I took a slow breath, the scent of pine and damp earth filling my lungs, a stark contrast to the cloud of floral hostility rolling off of her. My 20 acres were my sanctuary, the one place on this planet I had carved out for peace after 15 years of sand, shouting, and the constant thrumming anxiety of war. And here was this woman, this monarch of manicured lawns, violating that peace over a piece of brightly colored aluminum. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice level, the way you do when you're talking to a skittish horse or an armed insurgent. "Put the sign back. That is private property, and those signs are a non-negotiable safety requirement." She let out a short, barking laugh. "Private property? Don't be absurd. Your land abuts the community greenbelt. Your aesthetic affects all of us. It affects property values. We can't have our distinguished neighborhood looking like some backwoods hunting camp. It's tacky." She gestured with the sign toward the pristine, cookie-cutter houses of Northwood Estates, a sea of beige vinyl and identical landscaping. My land was the rugged, untamed shoreline to their placid, chlorinated ocean. "They're not for decoration," I explained, walking slowly toward her, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. "They're for liability. Deer season starts in 3 weeks. I don't want some weekend warrior with a new rifle and a poor sense of direction wandering onto my land, or worse, mistaking your poodle for a 10-point buck. Those signs protect you as much as they protect me." She waved a dismissive hand, the diamonds on her fingers catching the afternoon sun. "Oh, please, don't be so dramatic. No one is hunting in Northwood. We have rules against discharging firearms." The sheer, breathtaking ignorance of that statement almost knocked me over. As if a deer or a hunter tracking it would stop at the decorative brick entrance of the subdivision to read the bylaws. "That's my point, Karen. The deer don't read your covenants, and the kind of person who might illegally hunt this close to a development isn't going to care about your rules. But a big, bright, no hunting private property sign? That they understand. That's a legal warning." I stopped about 10 feet from her, planting my feet. "You are removing legally required safety postings. If someone gets hurt because you took those down, the liability could fall on you. And the HOA. For a flicker of a second, a tiny crack appeared in her cast-iron certainty, but it was quickly paved over with another layer of arrogance. She tossed my sign into her golf cart with the others. "That's a ridiculous threat, Sergeant. The only liability here is the eyesore you've created. I am documenting this as a formal warning. You'll receive the violation notice in the mail. $200. And if you put them back up, it's $500. Don't test me." With that, she squeezed herself back into the driver's seat of her cart, turned the key and zipped away, leaving a trail of exhaust and righteous indignation in her wake. I stood there watching her go, the silence of the woods rushing back in around me. The war had started. This was the moment the battle lines were drawn, not in the dirt, but in the thick, suffocating rulebook of an HOA run by a tyrant. If you've ever dealt with a power-tripping board member who thinks they're the law, hit that subscribe button right now and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to hear your own HOA nightmare stories, because you are about to witness how this woman's obsession with control became the very weapon that dismantled her entire kingdom. Before I bought this land, I did my due diligence. I was Sergeant Mark Renner, retired U.S. Army. I wasn't a man who walked into situations blind. My 20 acres were an anomaly, a parcel of old farmland that had been grandfathered in before the Northwood Estates development was even a blueprint. The deed was ironclad. My property was subject to state and county laws, but only to a few very specific HOA covenants, mostly concerning things like illegal dumping or commercial operations that would directly impact the adjacent neighborhood. Aesthetic rules like the color you paint your house or what kind of flowers you plant did not apply. My land wasn't part of their meticulously planned aesthetic. It was the reality that existed before their fantasy was built. I had a copy of the master deed and the specific exclusions highlighted and filed away. I had presented them to Karen at my one and only Welcome to the Neighborhood meeting, a meeting where she'd spent 20 minutes explaining the approved shades of mailbox paint. She had glanced at my papers, her lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line, and said, "Well, we encourage all our residents to comply for the sake of community harmony." I knew then that my definition of harmony, quiet, self-sufficient, and respectful of boundaries, was going to be very different from hers. I didn't put those signs up on a whim. I'd spent my first year on the property observing the patterns of the local wildlife. A healthy population of white-tailed deer used my woods as a corridor, moving from the state forest miles to the north down to the river basin to the south. And where deer go, hunters follow. Most were responsible, but every year you heard stories. A stray shot, a case of mistaken identity, a hunter getting lost and ending up in someone's backyard. The boundary between my land and the HOA's community greenbelt, a glorified drainage ditch and a thin strip of trees, was clearly marked with survey stakes. But to the casual eye, it all looked like one continuous stretch of woods. The signs were a bright, unambiguous line in the sand. They said, "This far and no further." They were a declaration of responsibility, and Karen Miller had just declared them tacky. I walked back to my workshop, the anger a cold, hard knot in my gut. This wasn't just about signs. It was about respect. It was about a civilian with a petty title thinking she could give orders to a man who had spent his life understanding the importance of rules that actually mattered, rules that kept people alive. She had picked the wrong fight with the wrong soldier. I wasn't going to get into a shouting match. I wasn't going to engage in her game of passive-aggressive notes and public shaming. I was going to do what the Army had taught me to do: document everything, build a fortified position, and wait for the enemy to overextend and make a fatal mistake. And I had a feeling Karen Miller was the type of person who made them often. The next morning, I went to the hardware store. I didn't buy more of the thin aluminum signs Karen had so easily ripped from the trees. I bought 4 heavy-gauge steel signs, the kind the state uses for road warnings. I bought 4 10-foot steel U-channel posts, a 50-pound bag of concrete mix, a post hole digger, and a set of tamper-proof bolts that required a special wrench. This was no longer a suggestion, it was a fortification. I spent the rest of the day in the cool autumn air, digging 4 deep holes along my property line, precisely where the old signs had been. I mixed the concrete in a wheelbarrow, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel a calming, meditative sound. I set the posts, using a level to make sure they were perfectly plumb, and filled the holes with wet concrete. As I smoothed the top of the 4th footing with a trowel, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. Let her try to pull these out. I let the concrete cure for 2 days. On the 3rd day, I bolted the new signs to the posts. They stood there, 4 feet tall, gleaming in the sun. Private property, no hunting, no trespassing. They weren't tacky, they were immovable. They were a statement of fact. To complete my defensive perimeter, I installed 2 new trail cameras. These weren't for watching deer, they were for watching the property line. I mounted them high in the canopy of 2 ancient oaks, perfectly camouflaged and angled to cover the new signs and the entire stretch of boundary where Karen had confronted me. I checked the batteries, formatted the SD cards, and switched them on. The trap was set. It took less than 24 hours for her to take the bait. I was reviewing the camera footage the next evening when I saw it. Her golf cart appeared at the edge of the frame, bumping to a stop. Karen heaved herself out, her face a thundercloud of rage. The video was silent, but her body language screamed. She marched up to the first sign and grabbed the post, trying to yank it out of the ground. The post didn't move. She put her shoulder into it, her face turning a blotchy red. Nothing. She kicked the base, then recoiled, shaking her foot in pain. It was almost comical, watching this woman wage a one-sided war against a steel post set in 300 pounds of concrete. But the comedy curdled into something uglier. She stormed back to her golf cart and rummaged around in the back, finally producing a massive pair of bolt cutters. She was prepared for escalation. I leaned closer to the monitor, my jaw tight. She positioned the jaws of the cutters around the steel sign itself and began to squeeze. It took all of her considerable weight, but with a final convulsive heave, she managed to snap the corner of the sign. It wasn't a clean cut, it was a mangled, twisted tear of metal. She did the same to the other side, destroying the sign until it hung from the post like a broken tooth. She then moved down the line, repeating the act of vandalism on all four signs. When she was finished, she gathered the 4 pieces of ruined steel, carried them over to the end of my gravel driveway, and threw them down. Then she pulled a piece of paper from her clipboard, taped it to one of the mangled signs, and drove off. I saved the video file to 3 separate hard drives. I walked down the driveway and retrieved my destroyed property. The paper she'd taped to it was, as expected, an official HOA violation notice. The fine was $500 for failure to remove unapproved structures, signposts. Below that, another fine for $100 for improper disposal of landscape debris, with an arrow pointing to the very signs she had just destroyed and dumped. The audacity was breathtaking. This was no longer just a power trip. This was criminal destruction of property and a fraudulent attempt to fine me for her own actions. I took high-resolution photos of the notice and the destroyed signs from every conceivable angle. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk and drafted a letter. It was addressed to the Northwood Estates HOA Board of Directors, care of Karen Miller. It was professional, dispassionate, and utterly damning. I detailed the initial confrontation, the installation of the new post for safety reasons, and the subsequent destruction of my property, an act I had on video. I cited the relevant state statutes regarding criminal mischief and vandalism. I included an itemized invoice for the cost of the replacement signs, the posts, the concrete, and 3 hours of my labor billed at a standard contractor's rate for a total of $785.42. I attached copies of the fraudulent violation notices she had issued. I concluded by stating that my signs were a necessary precaution against injury and liability, and that by removing them, she and the board were assuming full and total responsibility for any incident that might occur as a result of the unposted boundary. I made it clear that her actions constituted willful negligence. I printed 2 copies. The next morning, I drove to the post office and sent 1 copy via certified mail with return receipt requested. This created a legal paper trail. They could not claim they never received it. The other copy I took to the county sheriff's office. I filed a formal report for destruction of private property and attached a copy of my letter and a thumb drive containing the video evidence. The desk sergeant, a weary-looking man with a thick mustache, watched the video on his monitor, his eyebrows climbing higher and higher. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, shaking his head. "You get all kinds. We'll open a file on this, Mr. Renner. Probably won't go anywhere unless you want to press charges, but it's on the record now." That was all I needed. It was on the record. The gears of consequence were beginning to turn, slowly but surely. I received no response to my letter, only another violation notice in the mail a week later, this time with a late fee added. They were ignoring me. They were doubling down, and in doing so, they were walking deeper and deeper into the trap I had laid for them. They had no idea what was coming. The air on the opening Saturday of deer season was crisp and cold, carrying the earthy smell of decaying leaves and the promise of winter. I was up before dawn, not to hunt, but to walk my fence line. It was a ritual for me, a way to connect with the land and ensure my boundaries were secure. I carried a thermos of black coffee and a pair of binoculars, moving quietly through the woods, enjoying the deep silence broken only by the chatter of a squirrel or the rustle of a startled grouse. My new signs, identical to the ones Karen had destroyed, were now in place. I had decided to absorb the cost myself for the time being, considering it an investment in the coming conflict. They stood as silent, metallic sentinels along the border with Northwood Estates. I had just reached the southern edge of my property, a good half-mile from the HOA boundary, when I heard it. It wasn't the crack of a rifle, but a human sound, a sharp, guttural cry of pain, followed by a string of curses that echoed unnaturally through the tranquil woods. It came from the east, from the direction of Karen's property. My training kicked in instantly. You don't ignore a sound like that in the field. I changed direction and began to move quickly but carefully toward the noise, my senses on high alert. I broke through a thicket of scrub pine and saw him. A man in full camouflage lay on the ground, his body contorted around his right leg, which was bent at an angle that defied human anatomy. His face was pale and beaded with sweat, his teeth gritted in agony. A high-powered hunting rifle with a massive scope lay in the grass a few feet from his outstretched hand. I could see the scene with photographic clarity. The man, the rifle, and the deep, eroded gully he had fallen into. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that we were not on my land. The survey stakes with their faded pink ribbons were a good 50 yards behind me. This poor soul was squarely on Karen Miller's immaculately unmaintained property. "Don't try to move," I said, my voice calm and authoritative. "I'm coming over. I'm a combat veteran with medical training." He grunted in response, his eyes squeezed shut. I knelt beside him, my mind automatically running through the CLS, Combat Lifesaver, checklist. Airway, breathing, circulation. He was breathing, albeit raggedly. No major bleeding. The injury was a closed fracture, but a severe one. A compound tib-fib, most likely. "My leg," he gasped. "I think it's broken." "I think you're right," I said, already pulling my phone out. "We're going to get you some help. What's your name?" "Dale," he wheezed. "Dale Pritchard." "Okay, Dale, I'm Mark. I'm calling 911 right now. Just try to stay still." While I was on the phone with the dispatcher, giving them our location as best I could, I did a quick assessment of the area. The gully he'd fallen into was part of a natural drainage system, but it was badly eroded, hidden by a thick mat of overgrown grass and leaves. It was a perfect ankle-snapping, leg-breaking trap. Dale, seeing that I was capable and in control, seemed to relax a fraction. "Saw a doe," he explained, his voice strained. "A big one. She ran this way. I was tracking her, crossed over a little path back there. Didn't see any signs, figured it was all part of the public greenbelt or something. Next thing I know, the ground just disappeared." I looked back in the direction he indicated. There was no path. There was only the faint trail the deer had made, leading directly from my property onto Karen's. It crossed the boundary right where my first set of signs, and then my second, had once stood. "You didn't see any no-hunting signs?" I asked, knowing the answer. "No, not a one," he confirmed, shaking his head. A move he instantly regretted as a fresh wave of pain washed over him. "If I'd seen a sign, I would have turned back. I'm not a poacher. I thought this was all undeveloped land." The wail of a siren grew in the distance. I made Dale as comfortable as possible, using my jacket to support his head. I then walked over, carefully picked up his rifle, engaged the safety, and cleared the chamber, placing the ejected cartridge in my pocket. I leaned the weapon against a tree far from where he lay. It was standard procedure. Secure the scene. The paramedics and a county sheriff's deputy arrived minutes later, their presence loud and jarring in the quiet woods. They worked efficiently, stabilizing Dale's leg in an air splint and loading him onto a stretcher for the long carry back to the ambulance. As they prepared to move him, the deputy, a young man with a serious face, took out his notepad. "Can you tell me what happened, sir?" he asked me. I gave him a concise, factual account of finding Dale. Then I walked him over to the property line. "This is my land," I said, pointing to my side. "The survey stake is right here. As you can see, Dale fell into this gully, which is about 50 yards inside the adjacent property, which belongs to the president of the Northwood Homeowners Association." The deputy nodded, scribbling in his notepad. "And he told you he was hunting?" "He was tracking a deer that crossed from my property onto this one," I confirmed. Then I delivered the payload I had been waiting weeks to deploy. "It's a real shame. I used to have 4 large, clearly visible, no hunting, no trespassing signs posted all along this boundary for this very reason. Unfortunately, the HOA president removed them. Said they were an eyesore. The deputy stopped writing and looked up at me, his expression shifting from procedural boredom to genuine interest. She took them down? Your signs? On your property? Twice, I said, letting the word hang in the air. I have the second incident on video. I even filed a report about it with your office last month. The file number should be on record. The deputy's eyebrows shot up. He looked from me to the gully where Dale had fallen and back toward the invisible line where my signs should have been. I could almost see the tumblers clicking into place in his mind. He knew this wasn't just a simple accident anymore. This was a case of deliberate, documented negligence. A storm was coming for Karen Miller, and she was standing right in the eye of it, completely unaware that the winds were about to tear her world apart. The wheels of justice, or at least the wheels of litigation, turn with surprising speed when a personal injury lawyer smells blood in the water. Dale Pritchard, it turned out, was not the type to chalk up a shattered leg to bad luck. He was an HVAC contractor, an independent business owner who made his living climbing ladders and crawling through attics. A compound fracture and the subsequent months of surgery and rehabilitation weren't just painful, they were a direct threat to his livelihood. His lawyer, a sharp-suited barracuda named Stephen Kane, saw the case not as a simple slip and fall, but as a gold-plated negligence claim. And his target wasn't me. It was Karen Miller and the Northwood Estates HOA. A formal notice of intent to sue arrived at Karen's doorstep less than 2 weeks after the incident. The amount was staggering: $700,000 for medical bills, lost income, and pain and suffering. The legal theory was a thing of beauty. Caney argued that the HOA, by creating and maintaining a community greenbelt adjacent to known hunting grounds, had a duty to ensure its boundaries were clearly marked and safe. By an act of its chief officer, Karen, removing my legally posted safety signs, the HOA had not only breached that duty, but had actively and willfully created a dangerous situation. They had, in effect, lured Dale onto the property under the false pretense that it was open land, and then failed to protect him from a hidden danger, the eroded, unmaintained ditch. The lawsuit sent a panic-laced shockwave through the beige houses of Northwood Estates. The HOA's liability insurance would cover some of it, maybe, but a judgment that large would almost certainly lead to a massive special assessment for every single homeowner. Suddenly, Karen's obsession with aesthetics had a price tag, and everyone was going to have to pay it. Her reaction was as predictable as it was self-destructive. She called an emergency HOA meeting held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room that smelled of chlorine from the adjacent pool. The purpose, she claimed in the hastily sent email, was to address the recent frivolous lawsuit and correct the misinformation campaign being waged against our community. I attended, of course. I sat in the back row, wearing a simple collared shirt and jeans, a silent observer in a room crackling with anxiety and anger. I placed my phone on the table in front of me and discreetly started a voice recording. Karen stood at the podium, her face flushed, projecting an aura of wounded authority. She launched into a prepared speech, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "My dear neighbors," she began, "we are under attack. A malicious and greedy individual, aided by a disgruntled resident right here in our midst, is attempting to extort this community." Her eyes flicked toward me for a fraction of a second. This hunter, this trespasser, broke the law by being on our property with a firearm, but instead of taking responsibility for his own reckless actions, he is blaming us. And his entire fabricated case rests on the lies of one man who has refused, from day one, to abide by the simple, common-sense rules that protect our property values. She then proceeded to paint a masterpiece of revisionist history. In her telling, I was a hostile recluse who had deliberately created a conflict over the signs. She claimed she had only removed them after multiple polite requests were ignored. She held up her fraudulent violation notices as evidence of my ongoing defiance. "He wanted this to happen," she declared, her voice rising. "He took his signs down," a bald-faced lie so audacious it made me gasp, "to invite this exact kind of trouble, to undermine this board and this community. He put us all at risk with his selfish and rebellious behavior." The room was a mixture of confused murmurs and angry muttering. Some people, her loyal sycophants on the board, nodded along, their faces set in grim agreement. But many others looked skeptical. They looked at me, sitting calmly in the back, and then back at Karen, who was now sweating under the fluorescent lights, her tirade growing more frantic. They knew me, at least by reputation. The quiet veteran who kept to himself, whose property was always immaculate in its own wild way. They knew Karen, too. They had all been on the receiving end of her petty notices and her iron-fisted rule. They were starting to wonder who the real disgruntled resident was. I let her talk. I let her spin her web of lies and deflection. With every word, she was digging her own grave, turning a case of civil negligence into something that looked a lot more like slander and malicious prosecution. She was trying to make me the villain, but all she was doing was handing Dale Pritchard's lawyer a motive. She was establishing a clear pattern of personal animus. She was, in short, destroying her own defense and any protection the HOA's corporate status might have offered her. As the meeting devolved into a shouting match between concerned residents and Karen's defensive cronies, I just sat there, my phone silently recording every lie, every accusation, every desperate, self-serving word. This recording, I knew, would be my closing argument. She thought she was controlling the narrative, but she was just writing the final chapter of her own downfall. The lawsuit was a catalyst. Before, Karen's tyranny was a series of isolated skirmishes, a fine here, a threatening letter there. People felt alone in their frustration, but the threat of a $700,000 judgment was a unifying force. Suddenly, everyone's money was on the line, and they were starting to pay attention. I decided it was time to move from defense to offense. My strategy wasn't to fight Karen on her turf of gossip and public shaming. It was to build a coalition based on cold, hard facts. My first visit was to George Henderson, a retired CPA who lived 3 doors down from Karen. George was a meticulous man who spent his days tending his rose bushes and his evenings balancing his checkbook to the penny. I knew he'd been fined by Karen for his garbage cans being visible from the street for 2 hours past the mandated collection time. I found him in his garage polishing a set of golf clubs. "George," I said, getting straight to the point, "I need your help. I think Karen Miller is not just a bully. I think she's a financial liability to this entire neighborhood, and I have proof." I laid it all out for him on his workbench, next to a can of wood polish. I showed him the photos of my destroyed signs, the fraudulent violation notices, the certified letter I had sent to the board that was ignored. And then I played him the video from my trail cam. He watched the silent film of Karen, her face contorted with effort as she destroyed my property, and his own face hardened. He pushed his glasses up his nose. "That's felony criminal mischief in this state, Mark," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The value of the property destroyed is well over the threshold." "I know," I said, "but that's not all." I then played him the audio recording from the emergency meeting. He listened intently as Karen's recorded voice filled his garage, lying, accusing, and defaming me. When it was over, he was silent for a full minute. "She perjured herself in front of the entire community," he finally said, more to himself than to me. "She's claiming the HOA is not liable while simultaneously admitting she took actions that directly caused the liability. Her position is indefensible." He looked at me, a new fire in his eyes. "What do you need, Mark?" "I need you to look at the books," I said. "You're an accountant. You know what to look for. I have a feeling that her mismanagement goes deeper than just petty fines." That was all it took. George was in. My next stop was Sarah Jenkins, a young mother with 2 small children who lived in the house closest to my property line. Her backyard was her kids' entire world. I found her watching them play on a swing set. I told her the story and showed her the same evidence. Her reaction was different from George's. It wasn't financial. It was visceral. "You mean that Hunter could have been in my yard?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly as she pulled her daughter closer. "If he'd come from a slightly different angle? My kids play out here every day." "That's why the signs were so important, Sarah," I said gently. "It was never about aesthetics. It was about creating a safe boundary." She told me about her own battle with Karen. A few months prior, Karen had tried to force her to remove the swing set, claiming it was an unapproved recreational structure visible from the community walking path. Sarah had fought back, citing the development's original plans, which advertised it as a family-friendly community. and Karen had eventually, grudgingly, backed down, but not before making Sarah feel like a criminal for wanting her kids to have a place to play. One by one, I made my rounds. I spoke to the elderly widow, Mrs. Gabel, who showed me a shoebox full of violation notices from Karen regarding the peeling paint on her mailbox. A mailbox she couldn't afford to replace on her fixed income. I talked to the Rodriguez family, who had been forced to remove the small basketball hoop from their driveway because Karen claimed the sound of their son dribbling the ball disturbed the community's tranquility. I learned that their son, Miguel, was on the autism spectrum, and that shooting hoops was his primary way of calming himself after a long day at school. Each story was a separate thread of cruelty and abuse. Woven together, they formed a tapestry of petty despotism. I invited them all, George, Sarah, Mrs. Gable, the Rodriguezes, to my house. We sat around my large oak dining table, the evidence spread out before us, my photos, my videos, their violation notices, their stories. For the first time, they weren't isolated victims. They were an alliance. George, armed with proxies from several concerned residents, formally requested a full financial audit of the HOA's books for the past 3 years, something that was his right as a homeowner under the bylaws. Karen resisted, of course, claiming the request was harassing and without merit. But the bylaws were clear. She had to comply. While George began his deep dive into the numbers, the rest of us started a quiet, methodical information campaign. We didn't use social media or flyers. We went door to door, talking to our neighbors, not with gossip, but with documented facts. We showed them the video. We played them the audio. We told them the story of the lawsuit and explained how Karen's personal vendetta was now threatening all of them with a massive financial penalty. The tide of public opinion, which had once been a murky pool of apathy and fear, was starting to turn into a clear, fast-moving current, and it was flowing directly against Karen Miller. The discovery phase of a lawsuit is where the truth, or at least a legally verifiable version of it, gets dragged into the light. Stephen Kane, Dale's lawyer, was a master of this process. He sent the HOA a subpoena ducis tecum, a legal demand for documents, that was a work of art in its breadth and specificity. He requested every email, every text message, every internal memo, every meeting minute, and every piece of correspondence related to my property, the sign dispute, and the general topic of boundary enforcement for the past 2 years. He also subpoenaed me, not as a defendant, but as a material witness. My deposition was held in a sterile conference room at a downtown law office. It was me, my lawyer, a former JAG Corps buddy I'd called in as a favor, Caney, and the HOA's shell-shocked attorney, a man named Bill Peterson who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Karen was there too, sitting next to her lawyer, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a thunderous expression on her face. She was required to attend. Caney started with me. He was professional, direct, and methodical. "Sergeant Renner," he began, "could you please walk me through the events leading up to Mr. Pritchard's unfortunate accident, starting with your initial attempts to post signage on your property?" I narrated the story calmly, just as it had happened. I spoke about my reasons for posting the signs, safety and liability. I described my first confrontation with Karen. I described replacing the signs with fortified posts. And then Caney said, "Sergeant, you mentioned a second incident involving the new signs. Could you describe that for the record?" "I can do better than describe it," I said, looking directly at Karen. "I have it on video." My lawyer produced a laptop. We connected it to the large monitor on the conference room wall. I hit play. The silent, high-definition footage filled the screen. Karen, red-faced and furious, wrestling with the steel post, retrieving the bolt cutters, and systematically, deliberately, destroying my property. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Bill Peterson, the HOA's lawyer, slowly took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. His eyes closed. Karen stared at the screen, her own image betraying her, her mouth a thin white line. When the video ended, Caney let the final image hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "And after this event, what was your next step?" "I sent a certified letter to the HOA board," I replied. My lawyer handed a copy to everyone at the table. In it, I documented the vandalism, provided an invoice for the damages, and explicitly warned the board that by removing the signs, they were assuming full liability for any potential accidents. Caney picked up the letter, his eyes scanning the key paragraph. So for the record, you not only warned them of the potential for injury, you put that warning in writing and have a U.S. Postal Service receipt confirming it was delivered to them? That is correct, I said. Bill Peterson sank a little lower in his chair. He knew, as every lawyer in that room knew, that this was the smoking gun. This wasn't just negligence anymore. This was willful, wanton disregard for a known and documented danger. It was the kind of thing that made insurance companies run for the hills. Finally, I provided the audio recording of the emergency HOA meeting. We all listened as Karen's voice filled the room, accusing me of sabotage and lying about the sequence of events. When the recording finished, there was a heavy silence. Caney looked at Peterson. "Bill," he said, his voice soft but laced with steel, "your client, the president of the HOA, is on video committing a crime. She's on record receiving a formal warning about the specific liability she was creating, and she's on audio recording lying about all of it to the entire community in an attempt to shift blame. Do you really want to take this case to a jury?" Peterson didn't answer. He just stared at his legal pad, which was conspicuously blank. He had no defense. Karen had single-handedly destroyed their case, immolated their insurance coverage, and potentially exposed herself to personal liability far beyond the HOA's corporate shield. The deposition was over. As we packed up, I overheard Peterson talking to Karen in a harsh whisper in the hallway. "What were you thinking, Karen? Did you tell me about this letter? The video? You've torpedoed us. The insurance carrier is going to drop us like a hot rock for willful misconduct." Her response was a sputtering, indignant whisper about disrespectful residents and protecting the community. Even now, cornered by irrefutable proof of her own wrongdoing, she was incapable of seeing herself as anything but the righteous authority. She was the captain of a ship she had set on fire, and she was still yelling at the passengers for not polishing the brass. I walked out of that law office knowing the tide had irrevocably turned. The legal battle was all but won. Now it was time to win the war for the community. While the lawyers were sharpening their knives, George Henderson was making his own shocking discoveries in the HOA's financial records. He'd set up a command post in his home office, surrounded by stacks of binders, bank statements, and invoices. When he called me over a few days after my deposition, his face was grim. "It's worse than we thought, Mark," he said, pointing to a spreadsheet on his monitor. "This isn't just mismanagement. This is straight-up grift." For the past 3 years, since Karen had become president, the HOA's contract for landscaping and snow removal had been with a company called Lawn & Order. Their rates were nearly double the market average. George had done his homework, getting blind quotes from 3 other reputable local firms. Lawn & Order was charging the HOA $8,000 a month for basic mowing and maintenance that should have cost $4,000. "And guess who owns Lawn & Order?" George asked, clicking to another screen. He showed me the state's business registration records. The sole proprietor was a man named Frank Rizzo. "I did a little more digging," George said, a sly grin on his face. "Frank Rizzo is Karen Miller's brother-in-law." It was classic small-time corruption. She had been funneling inflated HOA fees directly into her own family's pockets. The excessive fines she levied weren't just about power. They were about generating revenue to cover the bloated fraudulent contract. She was fining Mrs. Gable for a peeling mailbox to pay her brother-in-law for a $10 mow that he'd invoiced for $50. We now had 2 fronts to our war: Karen's documented malicious negligence in the lawsuit and her corrupt financial dealings. It was time to bring it all to the community. Using the HOA's own bylaws, we collected enough signatures to force a special town hall meeting. The stated purpose on the petition was to discuss the pending litigation against the HOA and review the community's financial standing. Karen couldn't legally refuse. The meeting was held on a Tuesday night. The clubhouse was packed to capacity, standing room only. The air was thick with tension and resentment. People who had never attended an HOA meeting in their lives were there, their faces etched with concern over the $700,000 lawsuit that threatened their bank accounts. Karen and her board sat at a table at the front of the room, looking like a tribunal preparing to pass judgment. Karen opened the meeting with a condescending, pre-written statement, full of reassurances that their legal team was handling the situation, and that the frivolous claims would be dismissed. She tried to shut down any questions about the lawsuit, citing attorney-client privilege. But this wasn't her usual easily cowed audience. These people were scared and angry. The first hand that shot up was Sarah Jenkins. "With all due respect, Karen," she said, her voice shaking but strong, "this isn't just about a lawsuit. It's about safety. My kids play 100 feet from where that man was injured. We have a right to know why the safety signs that could have prevented this were removed." Karen's face tightened. "That is part of the ongoing litigation, and I cannot comment on it." "Then let me comment on it," I said, standing up from my seat in the middle of the room. All eyes turned to me, because I have a short video presentation that might clear things up. Before Karen could object, my ally Sarah's husband Tom, who had brought a projector and a laptop, hit a button. The large white wall behind Karen's head lit up. The silent, damning footage from my trail cam played for everyone to see. The gasps in the room were audible. People were pointing at the screen, at the image of their HOA president, their leader, a common vandal in a pink tracksuit, destroying private property with a pair of bolt cutters. When the video ended, the room was dead silent. I then held up my phone and hit play on the audio file from the last meeting. Her own voice filled the room, weaving a tapestry of lies. "He took his signs down to invite this exact kind of trouble." The hypocrisy was laid bare for everyone to hear. The silence was then broken by a low, angry murmur that grew into a wave of outrage. People were on their feet, shouting questions at a stunned and sputtering Karen. But we weren't done. George Henderson walked to the front of the room, holding a stack of papers. "And while we're on the topic of leadership," he announced, his voice booming with the authority of a man who knows his numbers, "I'd like to present the findings of my preliminary financial review." He put his spreadsheets up on the projector, showing the inflated invoices from Law & Order, the side-by-side comparisons with other local companies, and the final damning slide showing the business registration linking the company directly to Karen's family. The room exploded. The accusations of negligence were one thing. This was proof that she had been stealing from them, using their money to enrich her own family. It was a betrayal on every level. Karen sat there, her face the color of ash, her carefully constructed world of rules and regulations collapsing around her, in a bonfire of her own making. She tried to shout, to bang the gavel, to claim the meeting was out of order, but no one was listening anymore. They were listening to their neighbors, to the truth, and to the sound of a petty dictatorship finally crumbling. The chaos in the clubhouse was a beautiful thing to behold. It wasn't a mob, it was a community waking up. In the midst of the shouting, Bill Peterson, the HOA's attorney, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, stood up. He had clearly been sent by the insurance company to observe, and what he had observed was a complete and utter disaster. He walked over to the podium, held up his hands, and a semblance of quiet fell over the room. "Folks," he said, his voice heavy with resignation, "folks, please, it is clear there are serious issues here that need to be addressed by the board and the community." But before he could continue with his damage control speech, Mrs. Gable, the timid widow Karen had terrorized over a mailbox, stood up on shaky legs. Her voice, though frail, cut through the tension. "I make a motion," she said, her voice gaining strength with every word, "as per Section 12 of the HOA bylaws, for the immediate removal of Karen Miller as president of the board due to gross misconduct, dereliction of duty, and actions deliberately detrimental to the financial and physical well-being of this community." A man I didn't even know immediately shouted, "I second the motion." According to the bylaws, a motion for removal made from the floor at a special meeting required an immediate vote of no confidence. There was no debate, no discussion. It was a simple up or down vote. Karen, her face a mask of disbelief and fury, shrieked, "This is illegal! You can't do this!" But George Henderson was already at the podium next to the lawyer. "It is perfectly legal, Karen. Page 47 of the covenants you claim to hold so dear. Shall I read it aloud?" He held up the thick binder of rules she had so often used as a weapon against others. Now it was being used against her. The interim secretary, a nervous woman who had been one of Karen's cronies, was forced to call the vote. "All in favor of the motion to remove Karen Miller as president?" A forest of hands shot up. It seemed like every person in the room, save for the two remaining board members at the table with Karen, raised their hand. All opposed? Karen and her two allies raised their hands, lonely islands in a sea of dissent. The motion carries, the secretary whispered into the microphone, looking as if she was about to be sick. It was done. In a public forum in front of all the people she had bullied and belittled, Karen Miller was stripped of her title, her power, and her identity. She just sat there, stunned into silence, as the community she thought she owned decisively and overwhelmingly rejected her. The meeting quickly moved to elect an interim board. George Henderson was nominated and unanimously voted in as the new acting president. Sarah Jenkins took a seat as the new head of the Safety and Compliance Committee. They were leaders born not of a desire for power, but from a necessity to fix what was broken. As the meeting adjourned, people were shaking hands, clapping each other on the back, and talking with an energy and camaraderie the community hadn't seen in years. I saw the HOA's lawyer, Bill Peterson, having a very quiet, very intense conversation with Karen in the corner. I couldn't hear the words, but the message was clear from his grim face and her horrified expression. A few days later, the official letter arrived. The HOA's insurance carrier had issued a reservation of rights, officially informing the board that they would not provide coverage for any judgment stemming from the willful, malicious, and criminal acts of an officer. They would defend the HOA itself, but Karen Miller was on her own. Her actions, so far outside the scope of her duties as president, had pierced the corporate veil that was supposed to protect board members. The lawsuit, which was once against the Northwood Estates HOA, was now effectively against Karen Miller, the private citizen. The hunter's lawyer, Stephen Kane, wasted no time. He amended the lawsuit, naming Karen personally as the primary defendant. She was no longer shielded by the community's resources. The $700,000 problem was now hers and hers alone. She had built her kingdom on a foundation of paper rules, and now the weight of all that paper was about to crush her. The legal battle that followed was a slow, grinding process, but the outcome was never in doubt. Faced with the video evidence, the certified letter, the audio recording of her lies, and the testimony of nearly a dozen residents about her pattern of harassment, Karen had no viable defense. Her lawyer, a man she had to hire out of her own pocket, advised her to settle. Pleading her case to a jury would be an act of financial suicide. The settlement was finalized 6 months after that fateful town hall meeting. While the exact terms were confidential, the rumors that circulated through the neighborhood put the number at just over $650,000. Dale Pritchard would have his medical bills covered, his lost wages restored, and a significant sum left over for the pain and suffering her arrogance had caused him. For Karen, it was a ruinous blow. She and her husband weren't fabulously wealthy. They were comfortable, living in a nice house in a nice neighborhood, but they didn't have that kind of money sitting in the bank. To satisfy the judgment, they had to liquidate everything: their retirement accounts, their investments, and finally their house. The ultimate irony was the for sale sign that went up on her perfectly manicured lawn. It had been professionally installed, was of a board-approved size and color, and was placed at the precise regulation distance from the curb. It was a perfect, bitter symbol of her downfall. She was being forced out of the community she had fought so viciously to control, defeated by the very system of rules and consequences she had once wielded like a weapon. Meanwhile, the new HOA board, led by George and Sarah, was performing a quiet revolution. Their first act was to schedule a fine amnesty meeting. They went through Karen's records case by case. Mrs. Gable's shoebox of fines for her peeling mailbox was ceremoniously thrown into a paper shredder, and the board voted to use HOA funds to buy her a new, beautiful mailbox and have it installed. The Rodriguez family was personally encouraged to put their basketball hoop back up, and George even went over and helped them anchor it to the driveway. The family that had been denied a wheelchair ramp for their aging parent had their application approved within 24 hours, with the board offering to help coordinate with contractors. The oppressive, fearful atmosphere that had choked the neighborhood for years began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of cooperation and relief. The new board also tackled the corrupt landscaping contract. They terminated the agreement with Lawn and Order, citing the gross overcharging and conflict of interest. They put the contract out for a competitive bid and ended up with a highly respected local company that did twice the work for half the price. The savings allowed them to reduce the annual HOA dues for the first time in a decade. They formally issued a public apology to me at the next community meeting. They presented a new, proposed bylaw, drafted with my input, that explicitly exempted large acreage, pre-existing lots from aesthetic rules regarding necessary safety signage. It passed unanimously. They even offered to reimburse me for the signs Karen had destroyed. I politely declined the money. Just keeping the bylaw is payment enough, I told them. The victory wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. I walked out to my workshop, pulled out my tools, and began work on a new set of signs. These were the best ones yet. I bought thick oak planks, routed the letters "No Hunting Private Property" into them, and painted the letters in a bright, reflective yellow. I sealed the wood against the elements and mounted them on the steel posts that were still firmly set in their concrete footings. They were strong, clear, and dignified. They weren't just signs anymore. They were monuments. They were a testament to the fact that one person, armed with the truth and a willingness to stand their ground, could indeed fight City Hall, or at least a tyrannical HOA president. They were a permanent reminder that boundaries, both on a map and in society, matter. The day the moving truck pulled up to Karen's house was a quiet, overcast Saturday. I watched from my front porch, sipping a cup of coffee. There was no sense of gloating, no triumphant fist-pumping, just a quiet, profound sense of finality. I saw Karen for the last time, directing the movers with a weary, defeated air. She looked smaller, diminished, all the bluster and arrogance stripped away, leaving behind a tired, bitter woman who had lost everything that mattered to her. She never looked in my direction. As the truck pulled away, a new chapter began for Northwood Estates. The for sale sign was quickly replaced by a sold banner. A young family with a golden retriever moved in a month later. I saw the father out in the yard, teaching his son how to throw a baseball. The sound of their laughter carried on the wind, a sound that would have likely earned them a violation notice under the old regime. The neighborhood itself felt different. People were talking to each other over their fences again. The community barbecue, which the new board organized a few weeks later, was a huge success. It was the first time in years the gathering felt like a party instead of a compulsory surveillance operation. George Henderson was grilling burgers, Sarah Jenkins was organizing games for the kids, and Mrs. Gable had brought her famous 7-layer dip. People came up to me, shook my hand, and thanked me. Not for being a hero, but for being a good neighbor, for having the courage to stand up and say enough. I felt a sense of belonging that I hadn't expected. I had bought my 20 acres seeking solitude, a refuge from the world. But in defending that solitude, I had inadvertently helped to build a community. I had fought for my own peace, and in doing so, had secured it for everyone else. I often walk my property line now, checking the fences, observing the deer as they move through the trees. My oak and steel signs stand firm, their yellow letters a clear and unambiguous statement. They are a part of the landscape now, as natural and necessary as the trees they stand among. They mark the boundary between my world and the neighborhood, but it's no longer a line of conflict, it's a line of mutual respect. The fight wasn't about the signs, not really. It was about a fundamental principle I learned long ago in the service, that true authority is earned through respect, not demanded through fear. It's about understanding that rules are meant to protect a community, not to empower a bully. Karen Miller's reign was a textbook case of power corrupted. She was so obsessed with enforcing the letter of the law that she completely ignored its spirit. She weaponized the bylaws to feed her own ego, and in the end, her own arrogance loaded the weapon that brought about her downfall. I didn't destroy her. I simply documented her self-destruction. I built a fortress of facts, of videos and certified letters and audio recordings, and I let her run headlong into its walls. The justice that followed was not of my making, but of her own. As the sun sets over the trees, casting long shadows across my land, a deep sense of peace settles over me. The quiet I fought for in foreign lands is finally secure here, in my own backyard. The war is over, and the silence that remains is the sound of victory.